Hi, my name is Vince Montana, and I'm doing the video discussion for EXW312 on the movie And the Band Played On. The first question reads, how did the political administration at the time impact funding for HIV/AIDS research? I think there's a lot of reasons why the government agencies would not fund for HIV/AIDS research, but I think the main reason was because of the stigmatization towards gay and bisexual men at that time. It was in the late 70s, early 80s. The gay and bisexual community wasn't really accepted at that time, was kind of frowned upon. So I think that was a major reason why funding wasn't given right away. Reagan talked about the epidemic way later in his presidency. In 1987, he talked about it, and AIDS was early 80s, late 70s that came. So I think that was a big reason why it wasn't funded immediately. From the book, I thought it was pretty interesting how Schultz explains, Schultz is the author of the book, Schultz explains his frustration towards the Reagan administration and Ronald Reagan directly, because the media focused so much on other health problems that was going on in the U.S. at that time. In 1977, Chicago had a Tylenol poison scare, killing 7 people, and Schultz was really frustrated because Reagan called the epidemic in 1983 of HIV that it was the most important. We needed to focus on it the most, more than any other health aspect that was going on in the nation. He said it was the #1 priority. However, that proved to be false, because the New York Times journals were writing front page stories every day about the Tylenol scare. He was talking about other diseases instead of HIV, which was probably the most serious health issue at that time in history, and at that time for the nation. So I think that was another reason why funding wasn't given immediately. The second question is, do you think the political administration's lack of acknowledgement of HIV/AIDS impacted the public's perception of the disease and the spread of the disease? In what ways? Like I said in the previous answer, Reagan didn't talk about AIDS and HIV until 1987 in his later terms of presidency. I believe we weren't really knowledgeable at that time of how serious this epidemic was and how many people were dying. People just thought it was targeted towards the gay and bisexual community, but that wasn't the case. People could attract the disease toward or from heterosexual sex and heterosexual encounters. And more lives each year were being affected and ruined, and people were dying. So I think the public's perception was kind of flawed, especially because Reagan didn't talk about it until 1987. No one really knew how serious this disease was and how many people were affected and how many people were losing their lives. The last question is, in your opinion, what were the most poignant moments in this historical perspective? There's a lot of moments that really stood out to me in the movie. Probably one of the most that stood out was there's a scene where the CDC is meeting with government funding agencies on trying to get more funding for hepatitis B testing. They said that hepatitis B testing was most effective to test for HIV, and one of the government agencies officials went crazy and said, "Oh, we're spending hundreds of millions of dollars on something that's not even testing for HIV; it's testing for hepatitis." And one of the CDC representatives stood up and basically said, "How many people, have to die for you to, give money and help save lives? It's not more profitable for you." And instead of spending money on lawsuits, why don't you spend money on helping people get through this disease and help people stay alive? Probably the last poignant moment that was in that movie for me was probably a scene where a man was in the hospital and he was obviously infected with HIV, and I could just kind of stood out to me just because of how sick he looked. He had like bruises on his face, bruises on his body, and the CDC would go in there and he said, "Let me hand over my book to you. I wrote it when I was a human," and I kind of highlighted that. I'm like, wow, these people who've been affected by such a disease don't even consider themselves humans, and consider themselves just like a piece of property or whatever. Um, and it just kind of stood out to me how serious HIV was and how it just ruined so many lives. I thought the movie was excellent. I definitely recommend it to a lot of people that haven't seen it. Um, I definitely recommend reading the book. I learned a lot of information through that. I have the book at home, and I highlighted some notes that Schultz said about Reagan, and it said about some of the other health problems that were going around in the nation. I think it was very interesting. So thank you very much.